DLV delicious people. I'm here today to review Starship Trooper. Kind of have a challenge in my hand when really just going through this film because I'm like, God, there is so much stuff going on in this film. It's like a cluster of just all this stuff, like all of this story and whichever. Not only that, but you get these like intermittent or these like kind of transitional commercial things, which are just like, would you like to know more? And you get all those scenes of that, and then I'm like, dude, I have so much that I have to memorize and remember from this film. And then we also have random commercials that come up in between it. It's like RoboCop all over again, because I thought RoboCop was a real challenge to review also. So going into this, I have probably seen this like quite a few times, and I have enjoyed this movie quite a few times, because really you uh, invest with the characters, even though it's a very goofy concept of alternate worlds or other worlds that are eventually being taken over by these bug creature things. We at some point have even a bug meteor for some reason that ends up landing on some part of what is to be planet Earth in part of this movie. And so, like, eventually we also have certain characters like Neil Patrick Harris, who is to be this kind of character who is to like be like the person who's to like think that he's psychic or somehow like a person that can understand or like I'm like, man, we kind of go in a goofy route in this movie, but of course we do. It has been a long while since I've seen this movie, but like really looking at it like 100% from start to finish now, I was like, this is such a really good film. There's so many interesting little snidbits out of it that you can enjoy. Like I think like it's a kind of cool football segment that they have in this movie, which I think they end up calling it like sport ball or something like that. Weirdly, I could be wrong about that, because there's some people that know like increment, like small, tiny, minute details of Starship Trooper that I wouldn't even begin to know. Uh, there is also a complex amount of bugs that are to be also in here. You can't just call them just bugs. It's got to be like plasma bug and tanker bug and this bug and that bug. I'm like, all right, because I Googled it and I'm like, all right, so every single one of these have a specific set of names, which is, I guess that's good because then I can easily, like when I'm trying to carve up the story when we get to spoiler time, eventually I should be able to come up with any like, oh, okay, well we transition on to this specific bug because it's during this part of the story. But yeah, like really going into this film, like I thought that this movie, like especially from the last time I watched it, I thought this movie was way simpler. Man, did I find out while watching this, like, wow, this is really complicated, but I enjoy the complexity of this story. Um, but, like, there's some interesting parts. So, luckily, we end up kind of focusing a certain batch of people that are to seemingly go on and eventually get the brain bug or the smart bug, which eventually leads into that. So, so going into this movie, kind of in the teeing up fashion, what is this about? But before that, what is my grading system of this film? Like, of course, this movie is to be like a great to almost epic kind of movie because it kind of like gives you a random batch of a lot of stuff. Like it gives you like that sport ball, I think, kind of segment or whatever that they end up calling their football in this futuristic like thing. Uh, they end up having like a combination of points in time where you're like really invested in certain characters, or there's just really just certain sequences where you're like, oh my god, like we're at this part of the movie. No, I don't like this part of the movie, because you know certain things are going to happen, or certain things are going to happen to certain characters, and you're like, ugh, like I can't wait to get past this moment because I just don't like this part of the film. Because why would you? Uh, but you, like, of course, would see it a million times over. It's interesting to find out that there were three movies of this done, like three live action versions and a number of animated versions of this. Because why wouldn't they? Because it'd be the cheapest route to be able to, or the easiest route, not the cheapest route. The easiest route to be able to do a number of these movies, because like you could create all kinds of stuff in an animated way, which would be a lot harder in live action because you'd have to really just chunk out all that computer animation. Whereas, like, if you just, well, it's probably one and the same, right? Like, basically, like, it would just be quicker because you would just be able to put like the animated character without having to forcibly put in like live action people. I don't know. It probably is about the exact same amount of work. But anyways, going into this film, great if not epic film. Uh, Really, we have like this whole, like, I think political thing that I might not understand, where it's all about like civilian and citizen, and that there's a difference and all this kind of jargon that opens kind of up this movie. Uh, like some kind of the technical stuff of this film, it might just completely go over my head. Like, because I know there's like mobile infantry, which of course is Rico's character, and then we also have the fleet, which is going to be Carmen's kind of people, where she at first decides to make this like a short burst kind of a thing, but then she eventually decides to make a career out of it. Because I think Rico at first was going to be reasonably just kind of mobile infantry for a short period of time, and then eventually he'll get back with Carmen, and all of this will be like them together and whatever. So, one thing that I probably won't remember is where the heck that actually Rico is from. I know they end up mentioning it on like a map and whatever. I think it was Buenos Aires, but I could be wrong about that. Like, if I'm wrong, then I apologize. So, or if I ill pronounce that, because that's bound to happen, because any number of things could be bound to happen. So, So teeing it up, what is this movie about? So we find that seemingly people can travel galaxies and whatever alternate planets that I guess are to have technical life or people being in on those planets. So eventually we have seemingly these bugs that are to try and go after uh, people on alternate planets, like if someone is to bunker down into certain other planets. So it's kind of like a bug versus trooper like movie, which eventually we continue to escalate further and further into this film to go into tanker bugs, to go into plasma bugs, to go into bigger massive bugs, and eventually we start to realize that these things are getting smarter. It's almost kind of like the Kevin Bacon movie Tremors, where like at first it seems like these bugs, like, or the tremor monster things, couldn't quite figure it out, or the graboids I think they were called, were like not quite figuring things out, and eventually it would quickly lead to their death. But then towards the end of the first film, eventually they started figuring things out, and it made it way harder for any one of the characters to like figure out how to kill this thing, and so they had to come up with like a stampede kind of way of doing things in the very first Tremors film. But anyways, with that said, so really, like, and plus this is this is such a hard to explain film, but I wanted a challenge for today, and I wanted to just, I guess, burn my brain out also. Like, I had so much knowledge. So let's go and do it, because yeah, it's basically like a shoot 'em up alien film, really following this group of people, eventually either through almost death or otherwise losing someone. So basically that's how it plays out all in a nutshell. So I think it's that customary time to otherwise say it's about that time again to go into this thing called this spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, like, at first in the beginning of the film, we have the transition from like, I would assume, like, high school student to deciding to eventually become a citizen or be a part of what is to be their military in this movie. So we get these mainly like three characters, which is Rico, Carmen, and Carl. Carl, of course, is the Neil Patrick Harris character, where he's to be like the kind of the kid that has this like mental ability that seems to uh, be teaching Rico how to channel his mental ability by showing him these cards from behind him. And now, in like a Bill Murray Ghostbusters opening of that movie moment, where like Rico has to figure out what card Neil Patrick Harris's character is thinking of, and eventually Johnny can't figure it out, and so Carl is like, dude, for how many times that you've messed up with this, you would think that you would have just so happened to like guess and get things right. But like Rico is just, I guess, not good at that. So, and then eventually Carl ends up seeking this one ferret onto his mother, evidently. So so let's kind of focus on like they end up kind of talking about a lot of intro stuff for this movie, but eventually we really like. I think my main focus to really just focus on the classroom, because there's to be this scene about this reporter like in the action, and eventually Rico is in the mix and he's telling him like, get the heck out of here. And so eventually people are dying and this report is being made, and all of a sudden the reporter ends up getting killed off, and the cameraman eventually gets killed off, Rico ends up getting hurt, and like that was like one bottle of time. But then they're like, well, a year earlier. It's like, what the fuck? Like, that's kind of like a jarring sequence that doesn't quite make any sense, because like it just looks weird. But then eventually they end up replaying the scene in this movie to just be like, oh, that's where that scene's from. But it's still just a weird, jarring thing. Because I haven't really seen this movie completely 100% from start to finish. So kids are in this classroom. We have a teacher who is to be Jean Roshsack. Roshsack? Good God. And of course, played by Michael Ironside. And eventually he'll be a teacher to eventually becoming one of the troopers himself. And will kind of be this like lieutenant. So we'll have that happening. So this teacher, who seemingly is to not have one of his arms, is to go and be teaching this classroom. And it seems that Rico is very distracted because Rico is too busy drawing. Rico and Carmen going and kissing one another in some kind of artist rendering drawing thing. And so it seems that Dizzy and Carmen are just kind of interested in what Rico is doing, because he's very much distracted. So Rico eventually kind of quickly does this drawing while class is going on, and so eventually this teacher, who is Gene, I'll just call him Gene because it's much easier, is to mention to people kind of like the economics of their world, and eventually is to ask the difference between a citizen and a civilian. And like, a citizen is a person that eventually is to go on and join this like military thing, and a civilian is just like the common Joe Schmo person who is to just kind of eventually go on and do alternative things that doesn't involve the military or whichever. So, uh, but then eventually it's asked, like, well, what's the real true difference between the two? And Rico couldn't quite figure that out. So Rico is to send this animation thing to Carmen, and it is basically show them kissing. And Carmen ends up editing this animation and sending it back to Rico. And so Rico receives it, and all of a sudden, it's to be this big thing of bubblegum that ends up blowing up in Rico's face in the animation. So we're kind of assuming that we are like this relationship, if they were to have it, like seems to be kind of like on the rocks uh right out of the gate, because even when both Rico and Carmen are like kissing after school is to be, or this class is to be done, really we're just kind of thinking it's like, well, this is like, it kind of feels like they're eventually going to break up at some point. It kind of feels easy or simple that like this relationship is not going to last. So transition us to eventually this sports ball kind of game where it's Giants versus Tigers. And so we end up having these moves that are to eventually be done by these people where I'm like, for the life of me, I would never think anyone would be actually easily be able to do any of these maneuvers in my life. You would have to naturally assume that somebody would have to have a decent sized enough like trampoline to be able to do some of the maneuvers that they want people to do within this football game or whatever. I can't think of an actual person that could easily just jump over somebody like they kind of do in this spot here, where uh, where eventually it seems that Xander, who is to be like on the Giants team, and he's to seemingly be against Rico. And of course, we're going to see these characters kind of butting heads for seemingly the rest of the film after this. Uh, Rico is to eventually just kind of get slammed by Xander because he's like, Rico is to be a person consistently distracted. To the point of him just kind of seeing Carmen in the stands, and he's like, "Oh, I gotta look at Carmen." All of a sudden, to get freaking pancaked by Xander and dropped like a sack of potatoes. Potatoes? I don't know why I said it that way, but cool delivery, right? No. Anyways, so eventually Xander is to eventually get the ball, get a touchdown, or whatever the equivalent of touchdown is for this sport. And like, because Rico ends up scoring, now Xander ends up scoring, and now it's like a 41-43 ball game. So I guess since the Tigers are to have the ball, Diz is, I guess, the technical quarterback of this, but I still don't know positions and whatever, because this is sports ball or whatever the heck that this is to be called. So maybe it's still football. I don't know. I think this is done in like Brazil or somewhere along those, like somewhere in Africa. So I don't, like, maybe they stole this idea from some sport in Africa, but it seems like the ball looks like a rugby football. Like, I don't know. So it's probably a combination of like rugby and football. Like, it probably is, or like for like American football, because there's other football things that are to be called soccer, but again, to each their own. So Diz is to be calling the plays, and Rico is just like, just give me the ball. Like, just give it to me. Like, I'll freaking like trampoline hop over everybody, and then eventually they basically redo that same play when they're doing their boot camp or their simulation where they have their laser tag thing going on between all the Starship troopers. So eventually, Rico is to eventually just jump and leap over everyone with his trampoline jumping skills. And so he ends up scoring the last goal of it all. And so, but it seems that Xander is eventually going to kind of mix it up with Carmen, or it seems that Xander is asking Carmen, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" Like she's like, "Hey, you're gonna be dating me." It's like, I don't think so. Like eventually they're going to re-meet up, and then she's gonna be like, "Oh, maybe it is time." So, so after this moment, so Rico is to eventually be fighting with his parents because his parents want him to go to Harvard, and instead of going and enlisting in the citizens and being a military character, they want him to go to Harvard, probably study law, and just like be filthy, stinking rich. But Rico's like, no, I don't want that life. So, so eventually, at one point, we have Rico, who is, I guess, like to be at some like dance that happens the very next night after this football game. So, eventually, Rico is to turn to this teacher that he saw in the beginning of the sequence, and is to tell him that that his class was his favorite class. We also have this one spot where we have both Rico and Carmen who are tearing apart this bug, which basically looks like a giant cockroach. And when really looking it up, I couldn't find the actual name for this like cockroach looking bug. I couldn't really find that anywhere. Because every other bug has a name, but this is to be like, I guess, the smallest bug of it all. So, so eventually we have Rico who's like flipping this bug over and just like cutting it open and just tossing out all these organs. Like, hey, Carmen, here's its stomach, here's its heart, here's this. And so Carmen is just like, and like she's gonna hurl. And so eventually Dizzy is just kind of looking on and like, yeah, she's gonna barf. And like we just have Rico who's just tossing her all these organs. Like, yeah, here's the heart, here's this. I want you to hurl, please hurl. And then of course Carmen freaking hurls and then runs off, I guess, to go to the bathroom because she's still gonna barf. She's still gonna burp. She's gonna lose her lunch. So, so let's get into a bunch of these like starter commercial sequences. Let's get to those. So, so there's to be this one sequence about this psychic who's to have this like third eye appear, and it's like, do you think that you're psychic? Like, maybe you should try it out. Maybe you should see whether or not. And like, so there's like, do you want to know more kind of thing. And so, and then there's to also be this weird, bizarre sequence where we have the troopers who are to hand out guns to all the kids that are to be in this class, which I'm like, this seems crazy. Like, we have these kids that are all like grabbing for these guns and like pulling around and playing with them. I'm like, who, what? And like and weirdly all the troopers are handing all these kids out bullets. I'm like, what is going on here? This is insane. And so we end up having this one kind of like UN spot where we have this Sky Marshal Dienes, who is to kind of mention about that they need to kill these bugs, and then eventually later on in the movie he ends up like retiring because he's like I can't do this anymore, and so all of a sudden Sky Marshal Maru ends up coming in, and she's okay, like my new strategy is we need to figure out like we need to like think like these bugs, and we need to like outsmart these bugs because it seems like we need to find the smart bug. And so like in the other secondary sequence of all these commercials, we end up having these two like experts like debating this, and like one guy is like, I find a smart bug offensive. Oh, I don't want to hear any of this. And we have the one person like debating it, that it's like, well, I think there is smart bugs, and I think that we should figure them out, and whatever, and just like two just bickering old biddies just talking about like whether smart bugs do or do not exist, and so on and so forth. And I think there's to be some other sequence where or it's other some trooper sequence like at some school or something like that. It's weird. So let's go on. So let's go on to the normally broadcast movie. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, so eventually we have the students. We have Carmen and we have Rico, who are to eventually go and look at their stats to kind of see how well they're progressing. And it seems like Carmen is in the 98th percentile, and Rico eventually is to go and look at his stats, and he's supposedly in the 36th percentile. And so Carl is like, hey, 36%, whoa, buddy, let's go and let's zoom that out so that way everybody knows you're in the 36th percentile. And Rico's just like, so, so yeah, so it's like, so they're all mixing it up, and so, like after the dance, like the very next day, they're eventually all to go off to join like their citizenship, because I guess like school is to be over at that point. I'm assessing, we're assuming. So now they're going off, and so Rico had gone and argued with his parents about where his life should be heading. So he decides to just run off and basically just have whatever he's on him as his like whatever he has left. Because really, Rico is just deciding, it's like, well, hey, when I join the mobile infantry, I should be able to easily just have like whatever I need for the next 2 years or the next whatever, right? And Carmen is like, well, yeah, like that should easily work out. So, so both Carmen and Rico are to eventually go off to eventually get their flights. I'm assuming, because eventually Carmen is to go off to join the fleet, so she has to kind of get like actually shipped out to somewhere. So Rico and Carmen are to supposedly have this one kissing moment, and Rico is to tell her that he loves her, and Carmen doesn't reciprocate that saying. So Johnny's like, how about you tell me you love me? Like, try it on, see if it fits. And so Carmen's like, I love you. And then she ends up going off and gets shipped off to wherever she's going to go. And so since she's joining the fleet, she's going to go and get eventually her rookie uniform on, and is to eventually go into this one little transport pod to eventually make it onto her ship, where eventually she is going to bump in again to Xander, who is to like technically be her superior, because technically he is to kind of be like her instructor somewhat. So we have him, and then we also have her superior, who is to be Captain Delator, Delator, Delatier, her captain. I'm gonna butcher freaking names. It's bound to happen because even in a simplistic thing like this, you would think easier names would be put together, but they aren't. So eventually, Carmen is to showcase how good of a ship driver that she is, to I guess the point where she is doing a I guess like a 90-degree backing kind of like with this ship, and she kind of like barely almost like misses the one side. And so Xander is telling Carmen, it's like, hey, make sure like you do certain things the right way, or otherwise you can make me lose my job. And so Carmen is like, like, so my job is technically, or your job is technically in my hands. I hope I don't screw up. But it seems like Carmen is to be like a really great uh, pilot, and it seems that both Xander and Carmen work extremely well together. But it seems like they never have that. Like it seems that Xander eventually is to tell Carmen, it's like, well, yeah, we're really good together. It's like I can anticipate everything that you need and what you're thinking, and the same goes for me. Like we can kind of we just know one another. It's like you and me are like the same person kind of thing. So like we're one mind of things. Uh, so let's go on to it. So Rico is to go into, I guess, what is to be called like boot camp. So, but it seems like laser tag and kind of goofy, weird, funny games. And so eventually the whole thing out of this is eventually someone is going to get like crowned like a person who's going to like be going from eventually the whole like boot camp thing is whoever does the best is the person that's probably going to get like their own detail, which means their own people underneath them. So they're going to be a leader. They're going to be in charge is basically what I mean. So these people end up going through boot camp, and so right out of the gate, Rico ends up finding out that Dizzy is to basically follow him and try to eventually go into transfer into Rico's details specifically. And that kind of immediately rubs Rico the wrong way. But we have Sergeant Zim, who is to immediately kind of order all these people around, people being in Rico's squad. So Sergeant Zim is to, of course, ask anybody. It's like, hey, does any of you think that you could knock me down? And I'm like, I'm sorry, anybody that is to get like straight into this, like, ain't gonna be knocking down some superior. That, like, I don't know what it is with all these military movies where eventually we always have that moment in a film where some right out of the the right out of the gates rookie is to all of a sudden just go and clock his superior. Like, this isn't A Few Good Men or wait, whatever the Richard Gere movie was, or eventually because A Few Good Men could also be the Tom Cruise movie. God, what was that movie? Something with Richard Gere. I might be getting that confused with the Tom Cruise movie, because it seems like they have the same freaking whatever. Anyways, so I always get those movies confused for whatever reason. But anyways, so yeah, it seems like everybody has to knock down their superior. So right out of the gate, we end up having this guy who's called Breckenridge, who's just like, yeah, sir, I'm going to go and try to take you down. And so this guy ends up getting a broken arm for his troubles. and so a medic ends up getting called over, and so all of a sudden Dizzy is to transfer over here. And so Sergeant Zim is like, well, hey, like, what makes me think that you're gonna be uh like good enough to be in my squad? And so Dizzy ends up like taking off her freaking like coat, and she's like, okay, let's go at it. And so one of the girls is like, yeah, she's gonna easily be sergeant. And then so yeah, so we have like Zim, who ends up putting his knee to this girl's throat, and she ends up passing out. And so Rico's like, ha, she passed out. Like, that's what you get when you freaking like you try to mess with the bull, you get the horns, kind of thing. Like, it's a Breakfast Club thing all over again. So so eventually these guys go off to lunch, and so we of course have uh, Ace Levy, who's to be, of course, Jake Busey, who's to be this guy who's kind of the lovable goof of a guy, where like he ends up kind of butting in line, and everybody's like, "Hey, the line's back there." And so Rico's like the only real guy that's really stepping up to Ace and just telling him, "Hey, man, get back in the line." And so Ace is to all of a sudden just be like, "Well, hey, uh, like we're gonna be friends." Like, immediately, like Ace is just like, yeah, I like you, like you're the only one that stood up to me, because a lot of people are just kind of saying it, but no one's gonna really just step up and like get back in line. So so eventually Rico is to go and get his lunch, and eventually Dizzy is to be like, well, can I sit here? And Rico's like, no. I don't even want to know you, because I know what you did. Like, I know that you followed me here like a lost puppy, and so I don't like that. I don't like that you're doing that. And so Dizzy's like, well, that's not why I'm here. But even though in all actuality, that's the reason why she's there. She's there knowing full well that eventually the whole Rico and Carmen thing was never meant to work out, and that Dizzy wants to just kind of pick up the pieces. We can really admit that, but also Dizzy is a strong woman that is to quite possibly also like want to work up the ranks too. So like there's kind of like two sides of this, where we can see where Izzy's going to quickly work up the ranks because she's uh, to be a really good strategist, I guess, is what we could really say about Dizzy. So, uh, so pushing on. So, uh, eventually Rico is to be sending this message to Carmen, and basically everyone that's in boot camp is to basically be mocking Rico as he's to do his video where people are mooning the screen and whatever. So he's trying to do this update, kind of giving this vlog to Carmen, kind of telling her what's going on and how he might enjoy that there and have fun and whatever. And then eventually, Carmen Carmen is to send him a video back as basically saying that like she really loves it here, and that all of a sudden she's decided that she wants to make a career of being on the fleet, and that her and Rico are eventually just going to be, I guess, just friends. And then Rico is like, like, and then all the people that were gonna make a goofy, funny thing with him before are now just like, oh shit, like let's give this guy some space. So, uh, so let's go into the laser tag or the weird games of things. So, the first thing that they end up doing is this like capture the flag kind of thing, where it's like red versus blue, and so of course Rico and Dizzy are on the blue side of things, and I think so is Ace. So, or no, wait, Ace is on the red side. So, what ends up happening is that it seems that Rico and Dizzy are kind of like blasting through a lot of these guys, and eventually we kind of see the copying and pasting from the whole sports ball event. And so I don't even think that that's right. I've said that I don't know how many times now, and it's probably not even accurate. So it's probably not even close. But if anything, probably anyone could actually figure that out by kind of finding out anybody who's to kind of go through this, whatever. Anyways, so pushing on. So eventually, Rico is to kind of lob over and jump over a numerous amount of guys and then shoot three people down with these laser guns. It's not live action, bullets, whatever. Like they aren't actually being killed. They're basically being all tasered and knocked down. So, because eventually Diz is to mention some football play to tell Rico that it's like, hey, I'm going to cover him, and Rico's going to go up top and grab the flag and be like, yeah, I did it. And so we have their superior Sergeant Zim and commander officer, commanding officer. That's all they got for him. They didn't even give him a name, or just like, well, yeah, we should probably give him a command. We should probably like go and give him people, and because it seems like he's a natural leader. Because so Rico is eventually get this pendant to just say like, okay, he's gonna be a leader. And so, of course, that's like right after that, he ends up getting the Dear John letter from Carmen. So Rico bounces back from that and is to do this kind of this next scenario where it's to kind of uh, knock down all these like dummy things that end up popping up. I'm like, this seems just like the exact same thing they just did, but now like weirdly they end up having this live action thing going on much more so where there's live rounds that everyone is to be given. I'm like, why wouldn't they be given blanks? Because why does it matter that it's actually live rounds? But I don't know. I guess they're just like, hey, we need them to really experience live rounds. Uh, so what ends up happening during this whole like scenario that they're doing is that while they're going through this thing and kind of just popping and just shooting up all of these dummies that end up coming up, all of a sudden we have Breckenridge, who is to all of a sudden have a malfunction weirdly in his helmet that he just really needs to desperately talk about. And so Rico is to think, well, maybe I can fix the helmet. And all of a sudden we end up having a girl who is Dejana D? Goofy name. I'm sorry, Phil, pronouncing it. She ends up accidentally falling over because she was to get like tasered by the dummy, and she ends up having her gun go off, and she ends up shooting Breckenridge and killing him because his helmet's off. And so the girl who ended up shooting Breckenridge, she decides that she's like, okay, I'm done. Like I killed somebody. I'm like she ends up going off and just leaving. So because eventually Sergeant Zim is to say like, hey, if anybody wants to go and quit at any time, like go and take the walk of shame and wash out and whatever. So Rico, after this whole thing is to happen, is to decide to almost quit also because he's like, yeah, the only reason why I went into mobile infantry was really just because of Carmen, and then eventually having Rico going and having one of his men killed, like obviously he's really thinking that he's not cut out for this. But the commanding officer was to say like, well, let's give Rico disciplinary actions and so that way he'll learn. So he ended up getting 10 lashes, and then he ended up quitting shortly thereafter. So Rico got his 10 licks, and so we have Zim who ends up telling him to bite down on this thing. It helps because he knows. And so this one guy comes in and starts whipping him in the back, just whipping the crap out of him. To eventually, Rico drops the thing. And he's like, ah, because freaking, I'm sure it hurts. Go and watch, God, what is it? Would You Rather? Where a guy's just getting freaking whipped consistently. And like it freaking like it looks like it hurts, and this guy's wearing a shirt. Rico is shirtless, and this thing is getting freaking whipped. So Johnny is to seemingly like give up and almost and to be a civilian again, and so all of a sudden he's gonna walk off, and so Diz is like, "Hey, don't give up!" Like, uh, and like Diz is trying to like talk him into like coming back or staying or whatever, and but Rico is just like, no, like I'm gonna go. So all of a sudden Rico is to walk off while everybody's kind of doing their like their kind of warm ups or their kind of jumping jacks or some goofy thing. And so all of a sudden everybody is to start running into one like direction to be running to this TV screen. And Rico's like, what the heck is going on? And so we have one guy who's shout out, we're going to war. It's like, what? Like, what? So Rico runs to this TV screen, and eventually they are to show that evidently Guinesares had been uh, designated by some bug meteor to eventually have gotten wiped out. So we have both Dizzy and we have both Rico. They're like, oh my god, like that's our home, Johnny. That's our home. And so uh, now that bait, because like Rico had gone on to do uh, some like video chat with his parents, mentioning that he was gonna go home, and that like he's kind of done here. And his parents are like, hey, okay, it's okay, like we'll talk things out, uh like we'll just kind of see what you want to do next, kind of thing. So and then all of a sudden like the screen kind of goes black because they're like, what, like this is some weird weather that we're having here, some black weather, what's going on? It must be rain or something. So all of a sudden they lose the connection, and then they find out that I guess it was a meteor headed to Buenos Aires or whatever this was. And so Rico is now just like, oh my god, like my home was wiped out, my parents are now dead because of these freaking bugs. Like, so Rico goes back to his commanding officer and is like, I want to just stay here. I want to either re-enlist or something. And so Zim is to like have the contract or the paper that Rico was to sign. And so Commander Officer kind of turns his head, and Zim tears up the paper uh, that he supposedly like gave up with, and is like, well, I didn't see any paper. So because supposedly it was filed, but then I guess it wasn't really filed. So Rico went back to his command, and so like after this incident, uh, we end up having like a moment where uh, eventually these guys are to go off and to get these tattoos together, and eventually kind of like drink it out because like they're old enough. And so eventually Rico is to bump into Carmen and Xander, and all of a sudden that eventually leads to uh, Rico and Xander kind of having this fight in this bar, I'm assuming. So and I know that this probably isn't perfectly aligned because I know there's an event that happens before this, but like we'll get to that. So uh, so Xander and Rico kind of fight it out, but they end up getting separated by either fleet people or mobile infantry people, and so eventually, like, they can't like really fight. But eventually, they'll probably bump into one another yet again at some point. So eventually, what happens is Rico is to mix it up uh, with this other kind of uh, fleet, or other fleet's not the right word. Um, Rico ends up getting mixed in with this other kind of squad of people, and we eventually coincidentally find out that Rico's teacher is to actually be involved in this squad, and now he's to be the leader of this place. And so eventually, this teacher is to basically I'm going to call him Gene still, and so Gene is to say, like, hey, like, for any new people that's to be here, aka Rico and Dizzy and Ace, like, hey, like, you stay here until you die, or I find somebody better. Like, I think that's like the superior thing that he ends up telling people whenever somebody gets like higher in rank. That's like, and so eventually Rico ends up copying exactly word for word what this guy says, because they're cool lines. Um, but yeah, so because Ace is to kind of mention how this guy was like a real hard ass, and eventually someone comes to the defense of that guy because it's like, hey, he saved my life. He saved my life too. So like we have a bunch of people who all got their lives saved by the guy that Ace is giving crap to. So it's like, oh, I guess maybe he is a decent guy. So anyways, so they mix it up with these guys, and they end up getting sent off to this mission. And so I think this is right around the time of where they end up having the reporter scene, where eventually the reporter is gonna die. So let's get into this. So the mobile infantry are being sent off into all these ships, these fleet ships, and so it seems that we end up having these plasma bugs that are firing these plasma plasma blasts into the sky, which is even going into outer space. So that all of a sudden is starting to hit some of the fleet commanders that are trying to have to like swerve through all these plasma blasts. So, like, interesting enough, the captain of Carmen's and Xander's ship was thinking, like, okay, supposedly we were told that these blasts were random and they were light. These aren't light at all. So eventually this fleet just starts to, which I don't even understand what the real legitimate point of the fleet is. Like, what is the point of the fleet? Like, we don't have any bugs that are in outer space. What are they really doing? Are they just like dumping off all of the military infantry, and that's all they're really doing? And then eventually they're like picking them up. Is that legitimately like all that they're doing, or is this fleet eventually dumping off? When all the planets are secure, they dump off all these people to eventually stay there and to like survey the planet. Is that what happens? Like, I am so confused what the fleet actually is, but I guess that's just me. So but eventually we have seemingly Carmen and Xander kind of making it through eventually this whole battle thing. So uh, that is with these plasma weapons, they end up getting kind of well through this time around. We also had a spot where eventually both Carmen and Xander were to spot this meteor and kind of like be able to dodge it in the nick of time. But it seems like they were too far away to contact anybody to let them know that this meteor is out there and it exists. But luckily, I guess both Carmen and Xander saved a lot of lives by dodging this meteor. So I'm trying to get all this in all little one fell swoop. So we have this mobile infantry all go down, getting shipped out or being deployed out. So eventually, what ends up happening is it seems that Rico and his group find a cluster of these plasma bugs, these massive plasma bugs, and so they end up nuking them with this kind of uh, bazooka like weapon that ends up detonating and like killing off right before they were to pop off this one explosion. So it was kind of interesting. So so eventually, what ends up happening, it like because I want to. Yeah, I was hoping to try to get this correct. So eventually, what ends up happening is they start going and having, of course, to shoot down a lot of warrior bugs or the arachnids, and eventually, it seems that uh, that's when we get the whole like report, and the news reporter end up getting killed, and the cameraman end up getting killed. Rico ends up getting taken down, and but luckily he gets rescued at the last moment. We naturally assumed that Rico was to be dead, but I guess we were to be shown otherwise. So Rico is to be taken in and to be put through the medical bay to eventually get his kind of thigh uh, re-put back together. And weirdly enough, they are to have said that Rico was to have died in action or killed in action. And so Carmen and Xander are to check all of the deaths because evidently there has been a massive amount of deaths during that whole thing. And so Carmen ends up looking up if Rico made it, and he supposedly died in action. So she's like, "Oh my God, he's dead." She thinks that he's dead, but he doesn't know any better. And plus, I guess it's too hard for them to give messages to one another, like, "Hey, I'm still alive," because they don't have things like cell phones here. So Rico is to be kind of rehabilitated with this whole thigh thing, and so Ace and Dizzy are to try to like get his attention in this tank, and so they're like, "Hey man, like you're dead." Like they give him a paper that it says he's killed in action. He's like, "Yeah, I'm not dead." Like as if he can talk in this whole fish tank of a thing. I'm like, man, that is going to be a miserable thing for the guy who ends up playing Rico, who has to be underwater, and he doesn't have like a nose plug, and he's just having to like breathe through this tube of a thing, and supposedly he's going to be in that tank for supposedly like 3 days, and I'm like, oh my god, like I could just imagine, like I would just be like, you have to like sleep in that thing, like how can you exactly sleep in that? And plus also like I would just be like I have to breathe, nose thing, breathe, like, but because how could you just be? I don't know. It's just weird. So, uh, so Rico goes back into action, and so eventually they send him out again, because of course they would, and so eventually what ends up happening is that Rico goes on and is to do like another kind of set of these kind of deployment things. And so what ends up happening is this time around, it seems like they end up getting kind of interesting and or different kind of bugs in this setup. So because I want to think if we have the hopper bug that ends up coming up just yet. No, I think that comes up later. Yeah, that comes up later. So uh so Rico's group ends up getting deployed, and so I'm trying to figure out how to time this perfectly. Oh, okay, yeah. It feels like I'm getting told by somebody what to do, but I'm not. So let's get to this tanker bug thing. So all of a sudden, this tanker bug just comes out of nowhere. And so Rico is the only one to jump on top of this tanker bug and is to blast through the back of it. And then he eventually goes and grabs a piece of it, puts a grenade in there, and then eventually this thing explodes. And everybody's like, oh, wow, like he did it. Yeah, that's great. And so all of a sudden the teacher's like, how did you come up with that? And Rico's like, well, like it felt like when I was like doing the game, in school, it kind of felt like that same old thing. I was like the captain of the team, and Gene was like, well, good, great. So eventually, it seems that they end up killing all the bugs, and so it seems that they are to be able, since this planet seems clear, that they end up going and like camping out, and they kind of have this whole party, and everything is going off there. And so like uh, Gene or the sergeant is to be like, well, hey, like everybody have a party, like freaking like everybody have entertainment and beer and whatever. And so to just go on and just to have fun. And so Dizzy is to eventually ask Rico for this dance, and Rico is like, "No, I'm not going to dance with you." Like, because Ace is going and playing this violin and whatever. So eventually, Gene is to pull Rico aside and to say, "Hey, like, you know what? Like, if someone is to ever give you a good thing, like, accept it. Like, don't throw away a good thing." So Rico is just like, oh, "Okay, fine. Like, I'll just so." Because eventually Dizzy is to go and dance on with some other guy, but then eventually who is to be Sugar Watkins. Interesting name. Uh, so uh, so eventually, whoa, I went too far. So Rico is eventually interrupt this dance between Dizzy and Sugar to eventually dance with Dizzy. And so like they get this like weird romantic dance of a thing. And so then eventually they both Rico and Dizzy go off to their tent, and then they end up start of course making out, and then of course they disrobing. Fairly iconic scene because everybody's like, ooh, Dizzy, yeah. So Dizzy, of course, to be shirtless. They're kind of and kissing and stuff. Like, there's only so much that I can really say here. So, all of a sudden, we have like a knock on the tent door, and so Dizzy is to just kind of get under this sleeping bag of a thing. And so Gene is to mention like, "Hey, like we found something here. So like, yeah, I guess wheels up in 15." And then all of a sudden, like Gene is like, "Who's in this tent with you? There's obviously someone here." And so Dizzy is to be there, and he's like, "How about 20 minutes?" Like, and then he walks off. And so Rico is like, "We can still do it in 20 minutes." So they go after one another, and so that pushes us on to have them go and start walking into this one spot. And I think that's where we start to get these like hopper bugs, these like flying ash like bugs, because Gene is to tell one guy to go off and to uh, eventually get a signal, because he's like the kind of uh, the message guy, like the telephone guy. Like, it seems like a lot of military guy and a lot of military movies, that guy is usually the guy that ends up usually getting killed fairly often in a lot of these things. So this guy is to try to send a message out to the fleet, and then he ends up getting grabbed by this hopper bug, and so he ends up getting flied off. And so this guy is gonna almost get like killed. And so Gene ends up taking this one like sniper rifle of a thing and shooting this guy. And Gene is like, "Hey, like I would love for you guys to do that to me if that was to ever be the moment where that was to happen, where all of a sudden we were to like I was to be in a really bad way where it seems like I'm gonna die anyways, so might as well just shoot me in the head." So so we push on. So eventually this group is to find this big bunker of a thing where eventually they'd have these like huge like guns there and that are stacked onto these towers. And so eventually they go further into this like bunker of a thing where it seems like a pretty good defense spot. Eventually they go in to find, I guess, these people, like a sergeant, which is the only guy that they find because everyone else is to be dead. So eventually they go in and find out that there was a hole put in underneath uh, one of these uh, like places, bunkers, whatever they're called. One of these rooms. So let's say that's probably easier. So there was a hole because a bug was to put a hole in there. And so we end up finding out that one of the people that I guess was doing intel or whatever ends up having a hole in their brain. And so we end up figuring out that it's like, oh, somebody took his brain. Somebody pulled his brain out. So they're like, yeah, it must be the smart bug or the brain bug that's trying to like consume our brains to learn our strategies. That's weird. So so what ends up happening is that they end up like exploding the hole that was to be presented there, and then the general is to basically lose his mind once they end up finding him that was in this kind of thing. And so the general is also to mention that one of the bugs drained his brain and drained one of the other guy's brains, and so like they're getting smarter, so there's no way that they're going to win. And so basically this general is like, we're all gonna die. And so like Gene is just like, keep your composure, general, you're losing your freaking mind, like almost to the point where he's going to want to just shoot this guy in the head because like the general's like, just shoot me. And so Rico is like, sir, like don't shoot him. Like he's just out of sorts right now. He's just kind of like he's just kind of been through a traumatic experience. Like give him a break. So all of a sudden, they eventually spot that it seems like there is going to be bugs coming their way, a bunch of warrior bugs. So eventually, Dizzy is to eventually try and get communications going. And so eventually, what ends up happening is that I want to try to like pace this out perfectly. Because I'm assuming. Yeah. It's like I'm doing the math in my head to make sure that I've gotten everything because there's a lot of stuff going on in this film. So, bleh. So what ends up happening is that we find out that they're going to, of course, be picked up because they're going to go and try to retreat here. And so there's going to be a lot of deployment ships that are going to go and collect all these guys right within this bunker because there's nowhere else for them to go. So they end up having this huge, massive defense and try to shoot all these warrior bugs, but eventually they're stacking up on top of one another, and eventually they're almost getting through to this like fencing of this bunker. And so so eventually we end up starting to see some military people end up dying. And so Rico ends up going and having communication, telling people like, hey, where they need to land. And so they're like, hey man, like this sounds insane. Where exactly you want us to land? It's like, well, like that's the only place where you guys can land. So eventually they go and they pick these guys up, and coincidentally, right at this spot, we end up seeing a number of deaths happening. I think we end up seeing Gene ending up getting like pulled underground, and he loses both of his legs, and so he has to get shot. And because like Gene is telling Rico, you know what to do, and so he ends up shooting him in the chest and killing him. And so then, shortly thereafter, that we end up also having Dizzy, who ends up getting stabbed multiple times in the back while she turns around trying to run off. And so Rico is running after Dizzy, like Dizzy, and like so. Uh, they end up like taking a piece out of her, and they drag her back into the ship. And so that's when Dizzy basically dies in Rico's arms, uh, and so eventually Rico is to go off to speak to the people that are flying the ship, and coincidentally that just so happens to be Xander and Carmen. And so uh, Carmen or Rico is to want to send a message uh, to the people, and they're like, well, like that's difficult right now. But all of a sudden, the main thing here is for Carmen to realize that Rico is to still be alive. Like Carmen is like, oh Rico, like I thought you were dead, and so he's like, well, I'm not. So because Xander is to mention to Carmen that's like, hey, I just saw like I just saw your friend back there, Rico, like he's not dead. So like Carmen is like, oh my god, I didn't like I thought he was dead. So now we go on, and so we eventually have oh, I think what happened here was Rico was to mention that he wanted that planet P or whatever to just be annihilated, to just be like completely like wiped off the map. And so then eventually uh when Rico is to go back onto the fleet and go and do a funeral service for Dizzy, and Carl just so happens to be there. Carl is to mention to Rico that they're going to go back there, that they're going to go back to that planet because supposedly they have a brain bug on that planet. That's why they weren't going to wipe it out, because there was some alternative motive for them not doing that. So they go back to this planet, and so now we get this spot where there's still the plasma blasts are to be shot out of this planet. And so now we get to the point where eventually Carmen and Xander are on their ship, and they get hit by these plasma blasts, and eventually now they have to abandon ship. And so sadly enough, the captain, who ends up like falling over, and she has this door that ends up closing on her chest, where she ends up getting split in half. And like Carmen runs back, she's like, "Oh no!" And the captain's uh, like, go on, Carmen, like go. And so Xander's like, she's dead, Carmen, and she pulls her off. Like, man, that scene is like so freaking sad, because you just like all these characters, and like any one of them who was to die, you're just like, no. So eventually, Carmen and Xander end up going into this escape pod, and they end up having to be thrusted back into uh, the P planet surface. And so eventually Rico is to get comms and to like hear that eventually they're going to land like roughly where Rico is at, coincidentally, right? So but Rico's people are to be sent into a certain kind of mission. And so what ends up happening is Rico is to uh, basically go on his own and have his one squad go in one location, and Rico and his group is going to another. to try to find Carmen because it feels that Rico can sense that Carmen is still alive. And so Carmen ends up going off and like I think at this point I don't need the IMDb anymore or the all the stuff that I just accumulated. Uh, I know this review wasn't perfect. I apologize. If any time people are like, "Oh, this wasn't perfectly done," and then they click off, that's perfectly fine. But this was freaking hard to do. This is so hard to do. There's probably so many scenes that I probably forgot about, or just did not do them in the most picture perfect order, or said the exact right things that happened at certain times. But anyways, so because we're close to the end here, thankfully, because this one is an arduous process to all remember all this stuff. It's anyways, but trying my best. So now, Rico is to go off, and so Carmen and Xander are to crash their escape pod, and then eventually they whip out these guns because they're like, okay, like what's gonna happen here? Xander is to have this knife, and so because I guess eventually they're gonna probably run out of bullets. Uh, so eventually what ends up happening is both Xander and Carmen are eventually surrounded by arachnids, and Carmen is to tell Rico that like they're uh, to be in danger. So Rico goes off to find them, and so right as Rico and his team is to get there is to be once this smart brain arrives and is to go and take its one thing that goes and stabs somebody in the head and drains them. This thing has already done that to Xander, and so Xander gives Carmen his knife before he's to die, and because all these like arachnids like kind of stab into these soldiers and then just kind of hold them there until this smart bug is to come so that way they can this smart bug can drain their brains of knowledge. So Xander ends up getting killed off, and so all of a sudden Carmen is to be tossed in front of the smart bug, and so Carmen ends up going and slicing this like sucker straw part of this alien to all of a sudden frustrate it and just be anger and just to anger it. But then all of a sudden Rico and his group is to come in and start shooting away at all these things, and so the smart bug ends up running off. Ace is to mention where eventually this smart bug is to run off to, and so eventually they just firefighting their way through all of these bugs, and eventually they grab Carmen and they run off with her, and so we end up having Sugar, who ends up taking the nuke, and he's like, hey man, like, because he ended up getting sliced in the chest, he's like, man, I'll take this, like, I'll go and I'll die along with all these bugs. And Rico's like, hey, like, don't be a hero, and Sugar's like, that's not what I'm trying to do. It's like he's gonna die anyways. So now Ace, Carmen, and Rico are running like heck away from this explosion because it's gonna be a pretty massive explosion. So they run off, and so they end up going back from whence they came to eventually find everyone like freaking cheering it out. Because eventually Zim is to find the smart bug and to just kind of have captured him and netted it up and whatever. So eventually Carl, who's Neil Patrick Harris's character, is to eventually go and touch the bug and say, it's afraid, it's afraid, yeah, we won, we beat it, woo! And so eventually Rico is to talk to Carl and is to mention about like, well, yeah, like you taught me to be able to find Carmen, and Carl is like, well, I thought it would have come in handy eventually. And but like Carl is to mention like, yeah, like I guess this is a real time in history. Like everybody's gonna like nobody's probably gonna remember all of us, but if anything, they're gonna remember of a guy named Zim who ended up finding this smart bug. And so they end up going and they end up doing some tests on this smart bug, like prodding it and whatever. like they end up doing this like kind of last sequence of things. Uh, and so basically, like, would you like to know more? Is like the commercial things where they kind of end off with, where everybody's to just kind of celebrate their win and whichever, because they end up just catching the smart bug, but the war isn't really over, but still. So, I think that's all I wanted to say about this movie. There's probably stuff that I forgot about. There's a lot of stuff to just talk whatever about this movie. There's just like there's the one spot where eventually Rico was to eventually um, see that there's going to be some like really young recruits that ended up just getting tossed right into the mobile infantry right at a boot camp. So these like kids really didn't get much of training, and they were so severely young. Um, but Rico's like, well, okay, like I'll just tell you, it's like hopefully it's either you'll either die or I'll find somebody better. This is Rico's Roughnecks. Ooh yeah, whatever. Anyways, so like yeah, I think that's all that I really had to say about this movie. I think I caught most of the big events that happened here, but everything is not going to be perfect. Everything's going to be ill timed. Whatever. It's a difficult movie to review. Uh, like I would love to see anybody who has ever done this like perfectly to minute to minute to minute, like done all the right sayings and all the right stuff for everything, because I'm sure that probably exists out there. Because probably one person has seen this movie a million times and knows it by heart and knows the ins and outs of it, because there's bound to be that person that exists. So, with that said, I am going to get out of here because this was a complicated thing to do. And also, this is a very long video, so I'm probably going to have to paste these two whatever pieces together. So I apologize for that, but I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.